Welcome to the Chasing Something podcast with me, Lorinda Pretorius. Here we get real and raw about the struggles and the joys of being a young adult following Jesus in a post-Christian world. Join me as I engage in tough, controversial, and highly relevant conversations to enable you to thrive in your chase. Hi beautiful people, and welcome to today's episode. As usual, I'm really excited for this conversation. Today we're going to talk about race and racism in the South African context, and I'm here with my friend Robynn. And yeah, before you start listening to this, I pray that you will just open your heart and open your mind and let this episode be a conversation starter for you. This might seem like a daunting conversation, but I believe that it is so necessary, and I truly believe that conversations can and will change the world. So for the sake of this conversation, I will represent white South Africans. I don't think that everyone thinks the same way that I do, but for the sake of this conversation, I will represent white South Africans. So, Robynn, thank you so much for being here. Do you want to just introduce yourself to the people and promote any of the cool things you're doing? Just tell us whatever you think is relevant.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege. I am someone who has shied away from talking about this topic, even though it's been so much of my lived experience. And that lived experience spans 35 years. My parents were activists in their university time, but the complexity of my particular context is that I am colored, and so there is that extra element of sometimes being in situations where you're not black enough, but you're also not white enough. So because my parents were activists when I was growing up, I had a lot of experience with the struggle and the complexities of it and the talk around it and the political journey that we've had. But it has been something that I've wrestled with in terms of what label do I feel comfortable giving myself. So yeah, looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I kind of forgot to mention, but I just want to put this out there, is that so you had a similar conversation on your YouTube channel, which kind of inspired this conversation, and you said something that I think was so beautiful, and you said, well, in this conversation, we will always come back to Jesus, and he will be the core of this entire conversation, because this is what it's about. As Christians, we find our identity in him first, but we also know that he wants us to bring the kingdom, and injustices like those things are not from Jesus. That's not what the kingdom is about. And so it is necessary to have hard conversations and to put our offense aside. And that's also what I wish for this conversation, to just if you're listening to this, put your offense aside. We're going to be pretty direct, but not in a harsh way, in a loving way. Because if we truly want to address this conversation, we can't jump around the truth. You know, you can't jump around what is truly happening and the way that we're thinking that can be problematic. And so, yeah, my hope for this is just to be pretty blunt, but I think that's necessary. I think that's so necessary.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
In the video that you're referring to, I make a quick mention of landing on Jesus. But in terms of my personal journey, as I've said, just really struggling with being in the middle. Colored people often feel like they're in the middle of this debate, and being raised to know and believe that actually that name even is a construct. And I remember a huge struggle for me in my third year of university. I was in therapy and around this particular issue. And the therapist said to me, "You should just pick one." And I think that was very short-sighted of her in understanding the complexity of it. But it wasn't doable. Because there's so much of my history and my bloodline that is intertwined. On the one side, my grandmother's Zulu. On the other side of my family tree, my grandfather is half Dutch. And so there is a real contending, and it's only in Jesus that I've been able to come to an understanding of my actual identity that supersedes all of these things and all of these names that we give one another. So as you're listening, especially as a white South African, if you feel like you don't want to wrestle with this thing of, well, I'm African, I'm not European, but I don't necessarily feel like I can say that I'm African, understand that I understand the wrestle for identity, and why I say we land on Jesus is partly because that's actually the only place where our identity can really settle. And so I just want to put that out there before we do get quite blunt.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and thank you for saying that. Yeah, that's such a... Before we start, I just want to say that I was in Finland. Well, I'm like, before we start, we've already started. But I was in Finland last year. I'm saying last year, but it's because the past 3 months has felt like 3 years. It's rough. Mm-hmm. But I was in Finland the first 3 months of this year. And that was so weird for me because that was the first time in my life that I've experienced people disregarding my nationality ever. And that was really, and it actually really hurt because I was like, excuse me? Like, of course, I'm really used to people being like, oh, you're from South Africa, but you're white. Like, yeah, okay. I mean, I've heard that many times, but like engaging in a conversation, especially because I was doing like society and social change. So we were talking about sociological things a lot, and I was kind of like talking about South Africa and what I think we can do or should do differently. And then this person was like, yeah, but we can't really tell them what to do. And I was like, I'm sorry, you yeah. I know you're you can Germany, yes, you can stay there, sit down. You don't need to tell us what to do. But don't come here. No, I'm not. I know I look like you. That doesn't mean I am like you. And being in like a very European context, you really realize your South Africanness. And I loved that I actually connected with South Africans in Finland. And at the embassy, the ambassador was amazing. She's so nice. She's also a colored woman. And we... a bunch of South Africans just came together for a braai in Finland. Love that. And we're all different ethnicities, but just coming there, we all knew we were home because we could laugh really loud. And it's just, we laugh about funny things and we're eating together. And you're just this is, South African is so much more than ethnicity. And to deny someone that heritage, because oh, but where are your parents from? South Africa. Of course, I know there's a bad history, but they've been here for 400 years. You can't just deny that that's where they lived, So that was a interesting experience. But now, since we're talking about race in South Africa, how would you describe the South African approach to race? And how do you think that compares to Jesus's view of race?
I think let me use an example. I know a lot of international students. When I say international, I mean from other countries in Africa, coming here and saying, I actually didn't engage with race as a concept until I came to South Africa. And I think for South Africans, because of the funny, crazy history that we have made race a way to actually structure our lives.
Yeah.
And so it has structured our architecture, it has structured our churches, it has structured how we relate to people. And so it's really structured our lives. And I think we're trying to detox from that drug. But I think from a biblical context, Jesus's perspective was, well, no, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the kingdom, in my kingdom. I'm not interested in the kingdoms of the world. I'm above that. I'm interested in my kingdom that I'm building. And in my kingdom that I'm building, and what I'm looking forward to and what I'm working towards is a time when every ethnicity, every tribe and tongue will understand what is actually important and worship together in my kingdom. And so, that's what I think is the difference there.
Yeah, it's interesting, but like I have a few or a bunch of international friends, and I often make this joke, and it's like, it's South Africa. Everything's about race. Like no matter what you're doing, whether what you're eating, like it's all about race. And then like I think the interesting thing about Jesus is, and I think this is also really important to remember, is that he doesn't deny our race or ethnicity or that experience that goes with it. He just says that isn't the core of everything. He should be the core. And to kind of like, we should have conversations about it, and we should learn, because the whole point is that we need to learn how to love others better. How can I love you better if I don't take the time to understand your perspective and your lived experience? And it also says that we need to bear one another's burdens. And I can't bear your burden if I am constantly telling you that's not true. Like, no, that's not a thing. No, like that is the gospel. Because that's worshiping Jesus. We worship Jesus when we love one another the way that he loved us.
Mm-hmm. I think more than that, it's also a thing about us being made in the image of God. And the image of God, the triune God, is he exists in community. He doesn't exist outside of community, but he exists in community of three separate persons that are one, three separate personalities, three separates that are one. And something the Lord told me a number of years ago, I was literally in the morning busy doing my makeup, and I felt the Lord say, you know what, you understand the concept of independence, but I really don't. And I was like, I don't understand what you're saying. He's like, no, you understand independence, but I don't understand the concept of independence because I've never been independent. And I think our part of being differently made without different ethnicities and skin tones and languages is that visual representation that we, and that hope that we can be one as he is one, and we have to be different in order to be the image of God. But it's in our coming together. Because if we were all the same and we were together, we wouldn't actually reflect the image of God, because that's not actually what God is like. The Godhead is three in one. And so you have to have the three to have that concept. And so I think it's the thing that makes it so difficult for us to show forth the image of God, but it's also the thing that shows us that we are made in the image of God, that we're different.
Yeah. No, that's so beautiful. So just to get into a few definitions again, can you define racism for me? Because this might seem like a mundane question or like why, but I do think that we don't always have a similar or the same definition of racism. So what for you is racism?
So I think it's an important question, because I do think that we've got words that we've made every day that actually started off as words that are very sort of academic constructs. And racism is one of those things where it's really a word that we use as commonplace, but it actually comes from an academic construct of actually discriminating against someone based on their ethnicity and their race. But I think which I don't think we deal with as much as we think. What we do deal with is bias and prejudice. That we deal with on a daily basis. But I think the clinical sort of academic example of racism, of literally hating someone based on the color of their skin, isn't actually that prevalent. You know what I mean? Isn't as prevalent in that core thing. Like, not everyone is Hitler.
Yeah. Hopefully not. That's a great thing. Not. But yes.
Yeah, but that is racism. That is saying, I want you exterminated because of what you look like. And so I think that's why people fight all the time and say, well, I'm not a racist, I'm not a racist, I'm not a racist, because they can recognize that I'm not trying to kill you. But what we do have to recognize is we all have biases and prejudices, and they do influence how we make decisions.
So here's a question that is kind of like unscripted, but I feel like it's a good time to ask it. Can only white people be racist?
This is one that I have really avoided because of that issue of what we're talking about, which is are we talking about bias? Are we talking about prejudice? Are we talking about racism where one part of society is superior over another? The actual construct of it makes it really difficult. And I know that there are people who say that only white people can be racist, but I think why people come against that is because we're using a word that we don't mean. And we're not actually talking about racism in its pure form. We're talking about bias and prejudice. And so when people look around and they go, well, we're all being biased and we're all being prejudiced. And if you take that definition and you say, okay, well, it's about one group having superiority over the other. Well, what is that superiority? Because then people will now say, well, then there's reverse racism because there's another culture that's superior. But superior in what way?
Yeah.
And when do we say, oh no, you're superior over me? So I think that if someone says that to you and says, well, only white people can be racist, then I would say, are we talking about racism or are we talking about prejudice and bias?
Yeah. It's not just a question or a statement that can go without a deeper conversation because
it's not.
Our definitions are not the same. And the same, because I know I've had this conversation various times with people because, I'm just that white person who has these conversations about race a lot. And a friend of mine, so if you actually Google racism, I think when Wikipedia tells you that it's this idea of superiority. So when one race believes that they're superior to another. But I actually think the word believe is in there. I'm not sure. But my kind of response in a way is like, I think any race can think they're superior to another. I'm not saying that's what history has told you, you know, like I don't deny history at all, and I never tried to justify it. I'm just saying that if we get to technical terms, I mean, anyone can believe they're superior to another person based on their race. Anyone can. But the same thing with what you're saying is, but what does that superiority mean? Is it in terms of like economic standard, I don't know, intelligence, social, whatever, like, so it's like and I think that's what people like. People like big terms, that are pretty undefined. I think that's the way our whole political sphere in the world has moved to, you know, like these tweets, like, and even Christianity, unfortunately, these sentences that sound really good or have a rough definition, but no one wants to get into the nitty-gritty details because they either don't know or they realize it's more complex, because most things, unfortunately, like, are very complex, and if we actually want to deal with it, we have to sit down and be like, you know what, well, I don't really know. Like, this has been my experience. And I think a lot of things, especially when it comes to race, we need to maybe get rid of the right and wrong so much and more focus on the experience. Not that I'm saying racism is ever right, but I'm just saying that the conversation, I think, will work a lot better if I'm more interested in your experience of it rather than your definition of it, you know?
Well, I think we can agree that in South Africa we had a racist regime.
Oh yeah, of course.
And we had racism in its pure form. I think the issue is, if we can acknowledge that, I think the debate happens with, well, what do we think is happening now? And so what people of color would say is, well, we're not experiencing apartheid now. So you can't say that reverse racism is happening, because there's no wholesale. And then at the minute I say that, somebody will disagree with me. So I think it doesn't, it's something that doesn't take us forward. But I think if we, and I think we have to ask ourselves the question, which is with many things, what do we want out of this relationship? And do we want a relationship? If we don't want a relationship, then let's not talk about it. You know what I mean? Move on. We don't have to come to an agreement. We don't have to come to a common understanding. Move on.
Yeah, that's definitely true. But I also kind of want to challenge people to actually engage in these conversations, especially,
for
sure, if you're not a Christian, then, you know, just live your best life. You can do whatever. Yeah. But if you're a Christian, I'm sorry, my friend,
you have no choice.
You can't deny a very core part of what Jesus is saying. I mean, actually, he's very clear. Literally, all the laws in the Bible can be summed up in two things. You need to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and you need to love your neighbor as yourself. I cannot love you if I deny your experience or constantly try to justify an injustice. Or, you know what, I don't necessarily think there's so many people out there justifying apartheid or whatever, but I do think there's a lot of people who just ignore the topic because it's hard.
Sure.
Just like many other things, like sex in the church and all these things. No, we don't get to ignore it. Because ignoring it does not make it go away. It makes it worse. It makes us ignorant, and it makes us ineffective. And that's not what we're called to. And so, yeah, even though it can be hard, I think that we need to really engage in this conversation.
Well, as a believer, there's a biblical boundary for us. You know what I'm saying? If we're calling ourselves believers, unfortunately, you don't have an out.
Yeah. It's fun out here. Come follow Jesus. He's like, take up your cross every single day.
Exactly that.
Yeah. He just loves making us uncomfortable. I love it most of the time. Sometimes not that much. But talking about racism, Can you explain to us or define from your perspective what is systematic racism? But also, what has your experience been with it? How has that affected your life?
So I think your one of the things that I'm fascinated about is how systematic racism still shows up in our architecture. For example, I'm here in Port Elizabeth at the moment, and South End is just down the road from where I am, and there's a little mosque opposite the area, opposite the fire station, I think it is, and then there's a little museum. And South End, that mosque is the only relic left from what was actually a very multiracial, multi-ethnic area, and where people were actually forcibly removed. And so the systemic part of it is that there were laws and systems in place that removed people from where they lived, and now those people predominantly live in the northern areas of Port Elizabeth, and in a more densely populated place where they didn't necessarily own the properties where they were, where they had been building wealth, where they were, or building a life for their families, and now having all the social ills that they are dealing with within their new community, which is obviously not so new anymore. But that's where a system causes an experience for people, and it will take a system to get them out of that experience. And now I'm really talking in the natural, just secular. I'm not saying if there's a miracle, if God, if I'm just talking about it in sort of a plain sense. So, for example, let's keep with the architecture. We then had different areas. So I'm in Walmer, and then we've got the northern areas. We've got Causton. Those things were systematically put in place that these people can live there and those people live there. And then, I've got Walmer Township on my left-hand side here from where I'm sitting. Now, the subsequent opportunities, quality of life, and daily things that people need to deal with. For example, if I live out in the northern areas, but I'm working in generally the white areas were built around the places where there's commerce. So I'm working on this side, so I have to travel. So and I have to rely on public transport and all that entails from a psychosocial perspective. That doesn't generally cross people's minds, but that is part of how systemic racism plays itself out, because the initial intent was the separation of people. But the resulting things that people are experiencing have nothing to do with race. And I think that's also what gets people a little bit confused when, I think especially white people, I'm just making a generalization, of when people engage in a conversation about race, they're like, wait, but why are you bringing up transport? Why are you bringing up school? Why are you bringing up your living situation? Why are you bringing up your job? Why are you bringing up economics? Because it just feels like it doesn't relate. But the reality is the root of the systemic stuff that was put in place has an effect on people's lives. So from my life, I have had to acknowledge how the system disadvantaged me, but I've also had to acknowledge, especially in my work life, how the system has played in my favor. Because as a colored person in this country, there were systemically more opportunities for me than for African Black people. And let me tell you how that plays itself out. So the system is the system, and it starts, and then you get into an environment where I was in corporate. I actually worked in banking, and because of some of the opportunities that my parents have gotten, I was better equipped in certain things. I went to better schools earlier on. I'm Afrikaans, so from a language perspective, that's a huge step up for me, because people feel less like I'm an alien. And they feel like, oh, we have something in common. Because predominantly at that time when I started my career, which was where am I now? Like, I'm 30, so like 13 years ago. It was still very much a predominantly white Afrikaans sector, the banking sector. And so my ability to speak the language, my ability to be fine and quite content with meetings being run in Afrikaans, and fully understanding what people are saying and being able to engage, made me seem more intelligent. Gave me more opportunities, gave me better relationships, because if you work in especially in a corporate environment, and because I was in the marketing and communication space, a lot of getting things done depends on other people. In general, in work, it works like that. What I bring to the table will, I need to get you to do what I need you to do so that I can move forward. And so because I could navigate that space with more ease, it meant that I got stuff done. It didn't mean that I was more intelligent necessarily. And so now those people weren't saying the K word. They were not saying mean things about Black people, but they were, because of the system, playing into the continuation of the system.
Yeah. No, I completely understand. I think something in South Africa that we can't deny complexes the situation even more is definitely language. And even if you look at like the Christian setting, having to choose between worshiping in your language and worshiping with people who don't just look like you, that's definitely a challenge. And in some ways, I sometimes wish that we could all just decide on one language. I mean, I love my language, and I'm sure people love their language too, but it's definitely one of those things that just makes it so much more complex, because now, like, I need to choose to worship in English, otherwise I can only worship with Afrikaans people. But the same for anyone else. Like, if you want to go to a Zulu church, that's great, and you can at least worship in your language, but you'll only worship with Zulu people. Like, that's just how it is. And that's, yeah, it's a real challenge.
It really is, and it's something very intimate. I mean, yesterday, I saw my mom, and I don't know why we were talking about this, but she just said, oh, we were talking about her writing in Afrikaans, and she's a writer, and writing in Afrikaans versus writing in English. And she said, even my prayer life, I cannot, when I pray in Afrikaans, I just connect with God. And so I want us to be clear that when we're saying about language, I'm not only talking about people of color, I'm also talking about white people, and that we've all kind of, as you've just said, unfortunately, at the moment, if we want to worship together in a multicultural space, that multicultural space is an English space.
Yeah, it is.
And that's hard.
It's an interesting phenomenon, and it's like you, especially in the church, I don't feel like I don't feel like people don't have the right to worship in their own language, you know? Like, I don't want to go to churches and be like, no, you should start being English or speaking English so you can accommodate more people. But then, in another sense, sometimes I want to be like that. I'm going to be like, if we actually want to bring the kingdom, right? And, like, we want to unite the body of Christ, should we not make the sacrifice? I don't know. I don't have the answers. It's just definitely something I think about quite often, especially because, you know, it's, 26 years after apartheid, and we're still pretty apart.
But think about how long the system was in place in comparison to 26 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like you can always do that. You can always compare it to, and I'm not saying we should be unrealistic. I'm just saying
Sure.
that I think we can always play our part. And
Yes.
we need to kind of, again, this is not even from a political or economical perspective, just as the church.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of decide what sacrifices we're willing to make and whether we're actually being called to the comfort of worshiping in our own language, or whether it would actually mean more to the entire country if the church
Mm.
in South Africa was more united, you know?
So I absolutely agree with you, and I would take it further to say, um, we need to say, Lord, we desire this, and then we need to see who He brings us, and then when He brings us certain people, we need to then say, okay, we've got some Xhosa people here, we've got some Afrikaans people, we've got some English people. How can we introduce some of that into our worship? Because I think what happens is we ask God for the nations, God sends us the nations, but we don't actually move forward and then make the adjustment.
Yeah, that's so true. That's very true. Because even if you're in an English speaking church, there's absolutely no reason why the only thing you should be singing is Hillsong. Like, that's just like, no, there's no reason for that. And that's something that I actually really appreciated well, I go to Every Nation church, and like, that's what I love about their worship is that I would say 60% of it is English, but it's not 60% Hillsong. Like a lot of them are like from African people, and then sometimes we sing Afrikaans songs, sometimes we sing a Zulu song, sometimes we sing a song in a language I have no idea what it is, but I'm just I'm just there having the time of my life. And I think, yeah, things like that, practical things like that, can really change the experience. And I kind of want to add to this with a question, and that is, how do you think we can practically dismantle systematic racism, let's say in the church? Let's not even look at the country, because that's a whole other conversation that we can go in depth in, but rather, let's just look at the church.
I think there's levels for me in this. So the first level is one-to-one. And I would ask myself, what is the profile of the one-to-one relationships that I have? So, for example, for the stay-at-home mom, um, do you have friends, and I'm talking across, this is for everyone, do you have friends that are um, a different race that your children are exposed to on a regular or semi-regular basis, and that they're exposed to as your equal, and someone that you trust, and someone that you confide in and that you genuinely love? Because I think, especially for white South Africans, white children can grow up with the only people of color they engage with being the ones that are in their parents' employ, and that their parents and they can give instructions to. And I think that that's very challenging.
That's
So
true. I think that can be very
yeah.
problematic.
So I think on a friendship home front basis as adults, we need to make sure, especially if we're parents, that we're engaging on an intimate level with people who are different races to us, so that there's a respect, there's an honor, there's an equalness in terms of intimacy and closeness that the people around us and we can experience with one another, and where we can have that one-to-one safety in terms of, I'm allowed to ask my friend these questions. For example, once I released that YouTube, I got a call from a friend of mine. We're very, very close friends. She's Afrikaans. And she just said, why is it that we've never spoken about this? And I mean, I'm so close to her that I'm totally in her family, and they're really a typical white Afrikaans family. And I've been in a number of situations where I definitely could have experienced some prejudice, some bias, some racism, and I just never have. And so it never was an issue. But the relationship itself was intimate. You know what I mean? As a friendship. And so I think one-to-one, we need to put some effort into that. So for example, again, I want to say I'm not just challenging white people. I have been challenged in this myself in this recent time, because I have spent many years not telling my white friends where the differences are when I'm experiencing them. And so I even had a friend in the wake of all of this say to me, "But you and I are the same." And I said, no, we're not. She said, "We're twins." And I said, no, we're not twins. I have just led you to believe that we're twins. And so I am changing that in my one-to-one relationships, being more accurately intimate. It's a small thing. For example, I used to, when I want to go to the movies, and there's an African American movie that's on, I would never tell my white friends that I want to go to that movie. I would rather just go watch the movie myself. And that excludes them from who I really am. So they don't have to come with me and my experience. They don't have to come with me, but there's something wrong in me not actually having proper intimate relationship with them. So that's the one-to-one level. Then I think in terms of your local cell group, community group, small group, I think there we can, I pray to God that there's some people of different ethnicities in your cell group. And so that would be one of the things I suggested to some comm groups in our church is, why not allow somebody of if it's a predominantly sort of Western culture, why not allow somebody of a different culture to bring something that they like to eat as a snack on one of the nights that everybody needs to enjoy, and they need to tell everyone what it is. Why not ask that person to bring a song, even if they play it on a CD, that they love to worship to, that's actually in their language, and expose people to that. Those seem like very small things, but it begins to open a door. And then I would say for everyone, if there's only one ethnicity in your cell group, I think still open the conversation up and challenge, and make it a challenge for your community to say, how are we doing in the rest of our lives? How are we doing with our colleagues at work? How are we doing? So at least make sure it's on the table. And then I think in the bigger church context, I would say what I've said previously, where it's, if God does send you people from different ethnicities, make an effort to know them, to ask them if they're having a good experience, and to switch some of your worship things, because that's easy to do. Easier. It's easy to pop in one Afrikaans song in your service, or one Sotho, Zulu, whatever song that everybody gets to learn, and you put the translation up. It's amazing what doing that one time does for people. Just one time. It's incredible what that does for people in terms of going, oh, you see me, you acknowledge me, and you celebrate me.
Yeah.
And so those are the three levels that I would think we can practically engage in.
I love that, because I truly believe that if you want to create spaces for people of color and say more white church or whatever, it's all based on this. It's based on, I see you, and I don't deny your experience. I don't need to tell you. That's why I have a really big issue when people have this notion of color blindness, then I'm like, don't even come here. Don't think. I also think you're also disregarding something that God created to be beautiful. And so to just deny it because that makes you feel more comfortable where something is really, not cool. But
and it goes against celebration. I think.
No,
When
exactly.
when we're saying, oh, we're colorblind, it goes against celebrating. I love Asians because they're different.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I love them because they're different. I love Korean food because it's different. I love Korean culture because it's different. And I'm not colorblind when I see a Korean or a Asian person. I'm like, dude, I want to know you because you're so different.
Yeah. No, if that's so true, because a lot of times I am pretty outspoken about, especially interracial relationships and how it's not against God's will. But one of the things people very often ask me is like, oh, but why did God create diversity then, firstly? The second thing that they always bring up is the Tower of, is it
Babel?
Yes, because I don't know the English pronunciation. And I actually heard the best kind of devotional on this, and it's this very great Bible scholar who is also part of Youth with a Mission, the organization, and he was just talking about the nature of language and how language is alive and changes with people, and how language and culture both is linked to a way of life and never stays the same. And this is when you go into linguistics or sociology, you will learn this. This is true. And he was just talking about, he said, and he's very like diplomatic in a way, and he's just like, I'm not telling you what to think. I'm not telling you how to interpret this specific Bible story. I'm merely suggesting an alternative. And he was like, what if spreading people out, giving them different languages, wasn't so much of a curse, rather than kind of fast forwarding a natural process? What if we would have always, and when you look at the history again of language and all those things, it makes so much sense, because language will change. It changes the whole time. Even like we have different dialects in just South Africa, or even though it's obviously not the smallest country, but in even smaller countries you have different dialects. And to assume that, and I'm not saying that, yes, the Bible was clear, like God did that so that they couldn't all, come together and try to be God or whatever. But when you think about like interracial relationships or stuff like that, to think that there's now going to be one mega race that's going to take over the world, it's just like living in an illusion, because there's too many differences.
There's too many differentials.
Like one of my best friends, she's like German by nationality, but actually her mom, I think, is Spanish and her dad is Portuguese, and she got married to an African American guy. And I promise you, it is the funniest thing. Their child is white. Like white with blue eyes. Like, and I just find it so amusing, because their family pictures is just so funny. And her husband, like, all the time puts on Instagram, he's like, how did I end up with a white child with blue eyes? I don't understand this. But it's true.
This is not supposed to happen. Yeah.
It's hilarious. But to assume that now everyone's going to be this light shade of brown or something is just, or like, I mean, you can have Asian and black people, or Asian and like, there's so many combinations, and it will never be one mega thing. So yeah, I think diversity is just all in all a blessing, and just shows us God's creativity, and like
Absolutely.
the food, because I'm such a foodie, and like the food that comes from different cultures, and how different cultures experience and express their worship. I truly believe that every culture has a part that is godly. Like, of course, I also believe every culture has parts that the devil has twisted, but we can redeem cultures, but we can only redeem them if we acknowledge them. And we're like, oh, I see you have something different. like, how can I create a space where you feel more comfortable in expressing that? And how can we learn from you? How can we also want to learn how to pronounce this word properly, like, and how can I pronounce your name properly? Teach me. I mean, I took like a month to pronounce one of my friends' names properly. I was like, listen, I am sorry, I suck, but I'm gonna just keep practicing. Okay. And they weren't offended at all, because they knew I was really trying, and it wasn't like a mockery or anything. It's because I saw them.
Yes.
I saw them for who they were, and I wanted to give them that. Like, I wanted to acknowledge them with the name that they preferred to be called, you know? And I think that's
so good.
I think that's so important. And another question I have is kind of, how do we start a conversation about race without being offensive? And this is obviously more linked to white people starting a conversation about race with people of color.
Yeah. I think focus on the news. Focus on what's happening on the news. I said this to someone, and actually their response back was, I think, such a valuable insight for me. So I said, for example, there's a whole lot of, if you're a guy, there's constantly in the European League football, in sports in general, there's always things about race and, somebody said something, or somebody got booed, or, those kinds of things. There's a quota system, etc. In business, in people's workplaces, on campus, there's always someone doing something that is related to race, or it really is a topic that is very prevalent. And I think that is actually, by referring to that and simply saying, hey, you heard what happened on campus last week. Like, what are your thoughts about that? Has nothing to do with that person. You're not saying, hey, and it has nothing to do with you. Do you know what I mean? So it's like a neutral territory. And I think one of the things that is true about people of color culturally is that Black cultures are very communal and community orientated. And so the thing that's happening out there to people feels very personal. And so you could get a very accurate description of what someone thinks by talking about something that's happening out there, so saying Bianca Scooby, what do you think of that? And actually just letting it fall where it falls and being able to engage in conversation instead of running away from it. I think that is a way to bring it in that shows that I know what's going on. I'm not pretending that it doesn't exist, even though I may have a different a different opinion on that thing. So I might not actually be okay with cancel culture, but it does open the conversation between us about race in South Africa. Referencing the quota system. So what this friend ended up responding to me is, I actually don't agree with the quota system, and I'm very uncomfortable with it, and that's actually why I do not want to bring it up in conversation. And so as that person, as a white person, they would then need to be vulnerable enough that if I open up this conversation, that I'm also going to be truthful about my actual opinion. So it's not just, let me talk to this person of color about race, but I'm not going to and I expect them to be truthful and to be honest and to be authentic, but I'm not going to hold myself to that same standard.
It's very interesting because a bunch of times I've spoken to white people about why they don't have conversations about race, and a response I often get is that they don't want to seem racist. They feel uncomfortable saying what they think because of that. But it's very interesting to be me, because I've actually never had that experience. And I think it's not because I think my views are that great or I'm superior or anything, but I think one of the things that really helped me is that my first real encounter with like race in South Africa was in a Christian environment. And I seeked out conversations about race in an environment that I felt was more protected, so I could learn how to engage in it. And now I go to you, Jay. So now I have conversations about race, and I mean, South African politics is something I very often talk about. I'm pretty vocal about it. And yeah, like I engage in these conversations often in even my classrooms. But I feel like one of the things that makes me not have this feeling of like, oh, maybe I'm racist, is that I am so willing to admit that I have bias because of my experience. I don't deny my experience or how that has formed how I view the world. I also don't deny the other person's experience. I will disagree, but I can still come to a place where I say, just because I disagree with you doesn't mean that that takes away from your experience. Because I realize that, and that's one of the biggest things that I think is really important in this conversation, is realizing that reality is really relative to a big extent. And my experience of everything is not the same as yours, and our realities are just not the same. And yeah, creating that space, being honest, and you know what? Being willing to be offended. That is a big thing. Putting away your offense. I mean, I've engaged in various conversations where everything I've ever kind of achieved have been blamed on white privilege. And that doesn't necessarily mean, like, that's not fun to hear. But if I actually want to talk to this person, I cannot jump on the wagon and just be like, you don't even know what white privilege is. Like, that's not the point. And I think it's hard to put aside your offense. And I think it's not fun when you feel like you've worked for something and someone blames everything on privilege. Not that I actually deny white privilege, because I do think it plays a role. But I think it's just important to look at, like, why am I having this conversation? How can I honor the person in this conversation? My goal is to learn and not to convince. And very often, actually, I've found that if I just sit there and ask you questions and I properly listen, then someone will ask me my opinion. And then I don't feel bad about sharing, oh, but actually I completely disagree, because this has been my experience. And now, because I didn't just come there to tell you my opinion, but you are genuinely interested, because you know, even though I don't necessarily know this person very well, because we've had a conversation where I really listened and didn't deny their experience in any way, I now feel comfortable sharing even my opinions that might be a little bit offensive to them. And I know they don't feel, because we have a mutual respect by saying, oh, I want to know what your experience is. I know it's going to be different. I might not agree. But I'm not actually engaging in this conversation to agree. I'm engaging to learn. I'm engaging to broaden my horizons.
I think it comes down to motivation, and the motivation of going, why am I having this conversation with this person? And sometimes you land up in the conversation. I understand that. Sometimes you land up in it and you weren't asking for it. But your ability to have your identity rooted in Jesus and not in what comes next is crucial. And your ability to sit in pain is crucial, because that's what shuts down the conversation. Your refusal to be uncomfortable on both sides, on everyone's side. If once I refuse to be uncomfortable and I want to be in a conversation that is inherently painful, and I want to be covered in a soft blanket in that conversation, there is no conversation. And I think that's the thing, is let's be honest with where we at So, for example, I have a very difficult conversation that I need to have that has nothing to do with race. I know right now in this moment, I am not ready to enter into that conversation unguarded. And that's not fair. And so I need to wait and I need to seek the Lord and get to a place where I feel like He's covering me and that I'm definitely going to give that person the benefit of my vulnerability. And I think that's where we miss it is I want you to be vulnerable. I want you to tell me the truth, but I also want to wear a bulletproof vest. But you don't wear a bulletproof vest. I don't want you to wear a bulletproof vest. I want to still be able to shoot back at you. But I want to wear a bulletproof vest.
Hi, friends. So, this conversation with Robyn actually got cut short because the power went out. I'm assuming most people who are listening to this are South African. Maybe you're not. But we had load shedding, which is when they put off the power because our power supplier cannot supply power to everyone. It's a fun situation, but this conversation was so good and I really hoped you learned something. Please reach out to me. The link to my Instagram and like the podcast's Instagram will be in the description. And if you want a part 2 to this episode, please just send me a message because I think there's a lot more to discuss. And I would also love to have this conversation with Black South Africans, Indian South Africans, and even white South Africans. So let's just keep the conversation going. And that is all from me. Have a beautiful day. Remember that you are so loved. And before you go, if you have not yet, don't you want to rate this podcast and, write a short review? It just really helps to promote the podcast. I also wanted to take a second to tell you that I have started Sunday online conversations about some of the podcast topics. So if you go to the description, I will put the link to the new Facebook community that I've created. And there I share all the information about what date we'll discuss what. And this is just a unique opportunity for you to connect with other Christians, other people who are willing to have tough conversations and to participate in these discussions, So please check that out. Have a wonderful day and see you next week.